August 1942, Guadalcanal. The jungle smelled of death long before we saw the enemy. It was a heavy, living stench that clung to the skin, the kind that even the wind refused to carry away. We had arrived weeks earlier, proud soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, disciplined, faithful, trained to fight and die for the Emperor. We believed in the superiority of spirit, that our will could overcome any weapon the Americans possessed. We had fought Chinese soldiers, British units, even Australians. We thought we understood war. But then came the Marines. The first night we encountered them was not under sunlight, but under the ghostly shimmer of a Pacific moon. Our scouts had reported movement along the ridgeline. Amerikujin, they said. Americans. Not just any soldiers, but the Marines. To us, that word soon carried the same weight as a curse. At first, we laughed. We thought they were merely men, soft and spoiled by comfort. We had been told that Americans feared close combat, that they relied on machines and firepower to fight from a distance. We thought they would break once we reached them. But when the battle began, the jungle itself seemed to turn against us. The Marines did not panic. They did not shout. They moved like shadows, communicating with hand signals and the low clicks of their weapons. When we attacked, they did not scatter. They closed ranks. Every volley was deliberate, every burst of gunfire controlled. Even when surrounded, they did not cry out. It was as if we were fighting the jungle itself, patient, silent, merciless. I remember the first man I saw die to an American rifle. He was Corporal Sato, a veteran from Shanghai, a man who had survived artillery barrages and bayonet charges. He was crawling forward when a single shot struck him in the forehead. There was no flash, no sound, but the quiet pop of a Garand rifle. He collapsed without a word, eyes still open. The Marine who fired did not move, did not even seem to breathe. Only the faint gleam of his helmet betrayed his position. We tried to charge them, shouting banzai as we had been trained. It was the cry of our ancestors, the final exhalation of life before death. We rushed through the darkness, blades and bayonets raised, expecting fear, expecting to see the Americans fall back. But the Marines did not run. They waited. The first wave reached their line, and then the night erupted in fire. Machine guns cut us down in sheets. Our bodies fell before we even saw their faces. Those who survived the first volley reached the trenches and met men who fought like animals, not desperate, but cold, efficient, unflinching. The Marines did not fight to live. They fought to kill. When dawn broke, the field was silent, except for the flies. The ground was littered with our dead. The Marines walked among them, searching for survivors. I pretended to be one of the fallen, lying still among corpses, breath shallow, heart pounding. I heard one of them speak, his voice calm, almost casual. Check every one of them. They fake it. His boot stopped beside me. A shadow passed over my face. The next sound I heard was the click of a rifle being reloaded. Then another Marine called out, "Move up!" and the boots walked on. Only later did I realize how close I had been to death. That night, when we regrouped, our commander, Major Tanaka, spoke softly, his face expressionless. He said, "They are not men. They are ghosts. They kill without anger." He was right. The Marines did not fight with hatred. They fought with purpose, like craftsmen at work. To them, killing was not chaos. It was order. As the campaign dragged on, we began to hear their voices in our dreams, the mechanical shouts, the short commands, the distant bark of machine guns echoing through the jungle. They moved mostly at night, their camouflage blending with the shadows. We called them Kage de Senshi, the soldiers of shadow. They advanced slowly, methodically, cutting down every path we used, surrounding every hill we held. They carried flamethrowers and grenades, weapons of fire and thunder. When they attacked, the air turned orange and the jungle screamed. Our officers told us to fight to the last man, to die before surrender. But as the days turned to weeks, our faith began to crack. We were running out of food, out of ammunition, out of hope. The Marines never seemed to tire. Even their wounded fought on. We saw them carry their dead with care, a strange gesture, one we did not understand. For us, death was duty. For them, it was something sacred. By September, the rain began to fall. The rivers swelled, the mud swallowed our trenches, and the corpses of both armies floated downstream. Yet the Marines still advanced, their helmets glinting in the storm. They were soaked, filthy, starving, but unstoppable. We could hear them singing sometimes, low and grim, voices like ghosts carried on the wind. I remember one night near the Matanikau River. Our platoon had been ordered to hold a ridge overlooking the American lines. The jungle was thick, the air heavy with the smell of decay. We could hear movement below, boots, metal, quiet whispers. Our machine gunner, Nakamura, adjusted his sights and whispered, "They're coming." But before he could fire, a single flare burst overhead, turning night into day. And there they were, rows of Marines crawling forward, rifles steady, faces hidden beneath mud and shadow. We opened fire, but their response was instant. Mortars screamed down from somewhere unseen, trees exploded into splinters, and shrapnel cut through our ranks. I saw Nakamura's head vanish in a spray of blood. The ground shook as their flamethrowers ignited. The jungle itself caught fire. The smoke was so thick we could barely breathe. Men screamed, not from pain, but from disbelief. November 1943, Tarawa. The sea was red before the first wave even reached the shore. From my dugout on Bidio Island, I could see the horizon trembling with steel. American warships filled the ocean, hundreds of them, their guns roaring like thunder gods. The bombardment had begun at dawn, and for 2 hours the sky rained fire. Every inch of sand, every trench, every bunker shook beneath the storm. We thought nothing could survive that. We believed the invasion had died before it began. Then the guns fell silent. For a moment, the island was still. Only smoke and ash drifted above the ruins. And then we saw them. The Marines. They came in waves, rising out of the sea like specters, their helmets glinting beneath the gray morning light. Amphibious tractors carried them toward the reef, but many struck coral and stopped. The men inside jumped into the water, wading through waist-deep surf, rifles held high, waves breaking against their faces. The machine guns on our bunkers opened fire. Dozens fell. The water turned crimson. But still they came. No hesitation. No turning back. They moved as if death were irrelevant. I remember thinking, they are not human. We had been told that Americans feared death, that they would break under heavy fire. But the Marines at Tarawa did not break. They advanced through the storm, crawling over the dead bodies of their comrades, dragging wounded men with them. Even those who had lost their weapons kept moving forward, clutching knives or entrenching tools. Some used their bare hands. From our position in a half-collapsed bunker, we fired until the barrels of our Type 96 light machine gun glowed red.
the smell of burning oil and flesh mixed in the air. I could hear the screams of men in English, short bursts of sound drowned by explosions. One Marine, I still remember his face, or maybe the shadow of it, crawled across the sand toward our position, bleeding from both legs. He carried a satchel charge. Nakamoto, the gunner beside me, shouted and tried to reload, but it was too late. The explosion erased everything. When I regained consciousness, the bunker was gone. The sand had become glass. I crawled out through the smoke, half deaf, half blind, and saw a sight that would never leave me. The Marines, standing among the ruins, blood and mud clinging to their faces, moving forward in silence. They were not celebrating, not shouting victory. They were just advancing, like machines built for one purpose. That night, the survivors among us gathered near the seawall. There were barely 20 of us left from an original garrison of nearly 1,500. The rest had been buried in the sand or scattered across the reef. Our commander, Captain Okabe, refused to surrender. If we die with honor. If we live in shame. None of us disagreed. But as I watched the Marines consolidate their positions under the fading moonlight, I wondered, what kind of men live without fear, yet fight without rage? We launched a counterattack before dawn. It was hopeless from the start. The Marines had dug in, their lines connected by radios and artillery support. Their mortars found us before we even closed half the distance. The earth erupted beneath our feet. I remember the moment when the man beside me, Private Sugiyama, disappeared in a flash of fire, leaving nothing but smoke and a smell that still clings to my memory. By morning, there were no more attacks. The island was silent. The Imperial flag still fluttered above the command post, but it was a lie. Betio had already been lost. When the Americans buried their dead, I watched from a distance through the wreckage of a burned-out bunker. They stood in straight lines, helmets removed, faces bowed. I could hear them singing softly, a hymn perhaps. There was no joy in their victory, only ritual. I did not understand it then, but I would later realize they mourned, even as they conquered. From Tarawa, the Marines moved onward, to Saipan, to Belelu, to Iwo Jima. Each island was a fortress, each garrison prepared to fight to the last man. We believed our faith would stop them. We were wrong. On Saipan, I saw their precision reach something inhuman. The Marines landed under bombardment heavier than anything before, yet their formations never broke. Their officers walked calmly through gunfire, directing men with gestures as if rehearsed. Every shot they fired seemed to find its mark. When we counterattacked at night, they met us with disciplined silence. No panic, no confusion, only coordinated bursts of fire that shredded our ranks. One night, I hid in a crater with 2 wounded comrades. Through the darkness, I watched a squad of Marines move through the wreckage. They were methodical, checking each body, whispering to one another. I realized something horrifying. They were not hunting us for glory or vengeance. They were cleaning the battlefield, erasing resistance, one movement at a time. When Saipan fell, the Emperor's radio message called it a noble sacrifice. But for those of us who survived, there was nothing noble left. We had seen our friends burned alive, our officers shoot themselves, our wounded die alone, and always the Marines came. Silent, relentless, emotionless, like the tide that never stops rising. By late 1944, word reached us of new horrors. Flamethrowers that turned caves into ovens, tanks modified for jungle warfare, and planes that rained fire instead of bombs. The Americans were not just advancing, they were evolving. Every battle they made them stronger, faster, more efficient. The Marines who came ashore in 1944 were not the same men we had fought in 1942. They had become something beyond soldiers. At Pelelu, we saw this transformation in full. The island was a furnace, 45 degrees under the sun, rocks cutting through our boots, water running out within days. We held positions inside coral ridges, confident that our tunnels would protect us. But the Marines adapted. They learned to burn the air itself. Their flamethrowers roared through the cracks, suffocating entire bunkers. When fire met flesh, the screams were brief. Many of us chose grenades over flame. Even then the Marines advanced, inch by inch, foot by foot. Their progress measured not in kilometers, but in blood. Every hill they captured cost them dearly, yet they never stopped. The more we killed.
February 1945. Iwo Jima. The air itself trembled. For 72 hours the island was bombarded by American battleships and heavy bombers until there was nothing left but smoke, craters, and dust. We had lived underground for weeks, inside the tunnels our engineers carved into Mount Suribachi, waiting for the inevitable. The earth shook constantly, like the island itself was groaning beneath the weight of its own death. Above us, the sound of the bombardment never ceased. We learned to eat without taste, to breathe without air, and to sleep without silence. When the shelling finally stopped, we thought perhaps the Americans had grown tired. Then the sky turned gray with landing craft. We watched through narrow periscopes as wave after wave of amphibious tractors crawled toward the beaches. There were thousands of them, a swarm of steel and men. The Marines had come. The first shells we fired from our coastal guns found their targets. Landing craft exploded into fountains of fire and seawater. But for every boat destroyed, 10 more appeared. Their artillery pounded the beach, their planes strafed the ridges, and the Marines, those unyielding ghosts, marched straight into hell. The sand of Iwo Jima was soft volcanic ash, thick and suffocating. They sank to their knees with every step, yet they kept advancing. We fired until the barrels of our machine guns glowed red, but the beach kept moving, alive with men who refused to stop. Our commander, General Kuribayashi, had told us from the beginning, "We cannot win this battle. We can only make them bleed." He forbade banzai charges. He forbade suicide before the enemy had landed. He wanted to drag them into the earth and bury them there, one by one. And for a time, it worked. Our tunnels gave us the advantage. We struck from beneath the ground, disappearing into hidden passages. We waited for them to pass, then emerged behind them. The Marines fought back with terrifying precision. Every attack we made was answered with flame. The Americans carried flamethrowers on their backs, and when they fired, the tunnels became furnaces. The air turned to fire. I watched men claw at the walls, their lungs melting before they could scream. The Marines moved like clockwork. Their officers carried radios and maps, coordinating artillery and airstrikes with uncanny accuracy. They never hesitated. When one fell, another took his place. It was not courage anymore. It was inevitability. The mountains shook under the weight of their firepower. I remember one night when our position was surrounded near the base of Mount Suribachi. There were 10 of us left, and the tunnel was filled with smoke and heat. Outside, the Marines were closing in, their searchlights cutting through the darkness like white swords. We heard them moving, boots crunching over sand, voices low and calm. "Check the caves," one said. "Burn them out." The first burst of fire rolled through the tunnel like a living thing. The flame filled every corner, every breath, every thought. The man beside me screamed once and then was gone. The walls glowed red. The air vanished. I ran, choking, blinded, half mad, crawling through the smoke into a side tunnel that led upward. Behind me, I heard the sound of grenades, dull thuds that shook the earth like distant thunder. When I reached the surface, the night sky was lit by thousands of flares. The battlefield looked unreal, shadows dancing through light and smoke, men fighting in silhouettes. The Marines were everywhere, moving between craters, advancing behind tanks that burned with orange reflections. For a moment, I thought I saw demons walking among the flames. At dawn, an American flag rose over Mount Suribachi. We could see it from miles away, a small piece of cloth against a black sky, but it meant everything. We watched it from our trenches in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The flag was a symbol not of victory, but of inevitability. It told us that our world, the empire we had believed eternal, was ending. The battle continued for weeks. Every cave, every ridge, every tunnel became a grave. The Marines advanced meter by meter, clearing the island with mechanical precision. Flamethrowers roared, demolition charges shook the ground, and mortars fell like rain. The smell of sulfur mixed with blood. There was no air left to breathe. The fire consumed everything. By the third week, most of us had stopped counting the days. We lived by the sound of explosions. We no longer fought for victory. We fought for the illusion of honor. Our food was gone. Our water was gone. And our radios were silent. The only voices we heard were American, calm, confident, disciplined. They spoke not like conquerors, but like men performing a task that had already been decided. One morning, while scouting a collapsed tunnel, I found a Marine's helmet lying in the dust. Inside it was a photograph, a young woman and a child, smiling. The paper was creased and burned around the edges, but their faces were untouched. I remember staring at it for a long time. It struck me that the man who wore that helmet was just like us, human, mortal, afraid, and yet he fought like something beyond human. Perhaps that was what made them so terrible. They fought as men who had already accepted their deaths, but refused to die easily. By the end of March, our last positions were collapsing. The Americans had taken almost the entire island. We were out of ammunition, reduced to bayonets and grenades. General Kuribayashi sent his final message. Our forces have fought honorably. The battle is over. We knew what that meant. The next day, he led a final charge into the night, sword in hand. None returned. When I awoke among the ruins, there was no sound of battle, only wind and the faint crackle of burning oil. The Marines were moving among the bodies, collecting the dead. They did not cheer. They did not gloat. Some knelt beside fallen comrades, whispering prayers. Others lit cigarettes with shaking hands. Their faces were blank, exhausted, older than their years. I watched them in silence and wondered how men could be so strong and so empty at the same time. Later that afternoon, I was captured. I was too weak to fight. They found me half buried under debris, my hands burned, my eyes nearly blind from smoke. A Marine offered me water, and when I hesitated, he pressed the canteen into my hands. "Drink," he said. His voice was firm, not cruel. I drank. The water was warm and metallic, but it felt like mercy. That night, as I lay among the prisoners, I heard the Americans talking. One of them said quietly, "It's over." Another replied, "No, it's not. Okinawa's next." The first man sighed, "And maybe we'll go home." Their words echoed in my head. Home. We no longer had such a word. Our homes had already burned in Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. We had fought for an empire that no longer existed except in our orders. From my cell, I could see the flag on Suribachi still waving. It was not a symbol of conquest anymore. It was a grave marker, for them, for us, for everything this war had consumed. Iwo Jima was only 8 square miles of volcanic rock, yet more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers died defending it. Nearly 7,000 Marines were killed taking it. The island was nothing but sand and blood, but it changed everything. For us, it was proof that no defense could stop the Americans. For them, it was proof that no sacrifice was too great to win. When I was sent to a prisoner camp months later, I met a young American guard who asked me, What was it like fighting us? I thought for a moment and said, it was like fighting a storm. You can shoot at it, curse it, resist it, but in the end, it covers everything. He nodded quietly. We felt the same, he said. You guys never quit. We looked at each other for a long time, two soldiers who had survived when neither side was supposed to. Then he said something I never forgot. We both did what we were told. Only difference is, we got to go home. For him, home meant peace. For me, it meant memory. A memory that would never fade. Of an island where men became monsters, and monsters became men. And that was Iwo Jima, the place where Japan's spirit met America's machine, and both learned the meaning of hell.
April 1945, Okinawa. By the time we arrived, we no longer believed in victory. We were soldiers of an empire that had already begun to die, sent to defend an island that had already been promised to the Americans. The air was heavy with the scent of sea salt and fear. This time we were not alone. Civilians were everywhere. Women, children, the elderly, all hiding in caves, clutching what little remained of their lives. We were told to protect them, but in truth, we knew we could not even protect ourselves. Okinawa was the final line. Beyond it lay the home islands, the Emperor's Palace, the heart of Japan itself. The Americans knew it. We knew it. That made the coming storm inevitable. The bombardment began days before they landed. The sky turned black with ships, hundreds of them, the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. From the horizon their guns began to roar. The ground convulsed with every shell. Our trenches collapsed. The caves we hid in became tombs. There was no up or down, no night or day, only thunder and smoke. Some men went mad before the battle even started. When the Marines finally came ashore, they did not come quietly. The sea itself seemed to carry them. Waves of landing craft filled the beaches, a living tide of khaki and steel. But unlike Guadalcanal or Tarawa, they did not rush forward recklessly. They came with calculation, every movement covered by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Americans had turned invasion into science. Our commander, General Ushijima, watched the unfolding assault through binoculars from a ridge above Shuri Castle. He said, "They will come slowly. They have learned patience. They will strangle us, not crush us." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed something else: resignation. He was right. The Marines advanced inch by inch, cautious, relentless. They moved behind the thunder of their own artillery, always protected, always coordinated. We ambushed when we could, but every time we struck, the sky answered. Their response was instant: mortars, airstrikes, tanks. The island itself became a machine, and we were trapped inside it. I fought near the southern ridges, where coral cliffs turned into killing fields. The rain never stopped. Mud swallowed the dead, and the wounded drowned where they fell. We shared caves with civilians, mothers clutching infants, children staring at us with hollow eyes. They had been told that Americans would torture and kill them, that surrender was worse than death. Many carried grenades, ready to end their lives rather than be captured. When the Marines reached our line, the chaos defied description. Flamethrowers roared through the entrances of caves, turning darkness into light, light into oblivion. The screams of women and soldiers mixed together until there was no difference between them. We fired blindly, our rifles shaking in our hands. The Americans came like shadows again, but now they were accompanied by tanks, monstrous machines whose cannons spoke in thunder.
At night the sky was red, and the sea glowed with burning oil. Ships offshore launched rockets that arced like meteors. Each explosion lit the world for a moment, revealing the faces of men who had already accepted death. One evening we launched a counterattack near the Shuri line, hundreds of us charging through the rain into the teeth of Marine positions. We screamed, "Ten no Heika Banzai!" and charged with bayonets fixed, not because we believed we could win, but because it was all that was left. The Americans held their ground. Their machine guns did not falter. Their rifles fired in rhythm. Every man who fell was replaced by another, their lines moving as one organism. It was no longer a battle. It was execution by precision. I fell into a shell crater filled with mud and blood. Around me bodies piled like broken dolls. I could see Marines advancing through the rain, their faces hard, their movements deliberate. They looked less like soldiers now, and more like harvesters, reaping an empire that had refused to die. For days afterwards, the civilians began throwing themselves off the cliffs. I watched from a distance as families lined up at the edge, their faces calm, their hands holding one another. They jumped without a sound, disappearing into the fog below. Others used grenades, huddled together in silence before pulling the pins. We had told them the Americans would come as monsters. Instead, they chose to die before discovering otherwise. When the Marines found the bodies, they did not cheer. I saw them stand quietly among the dead, heads bowed, as if ashamed. One of them picked up a child's doll from the mud, a small thing soaked and burned, and placed it beside a woman's body before walking away. That image remains with me more than any battle. It was the moment I realized both sides had lost their humanity, even the victors. By June, the Japanese command structure had collapsed. Our officers were dead or missing. General Uchijima sent his final order. "You have fought with honor. Now follow your conscience." That night he and his chief of staff committed seppuku beneath a tent lit by a single candle. The sound of rain drowned their last words. We, the survivors, wandered the ruins like ghosts. The battle had lasted 82 days. 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Tens of thousands of civilians were gone. The Americans had lost their own 12,000, and yet they called it victory. When I was captured, again, I was too exhausted to resist. The Marines who found me were covered in mud and blood, eyes hollow, uniforms torn. They looked as haunted as we were. One of them, a sergeant, stared at me for a long moment and said, "It's over." His voice was not triumphant. It was broken. As I sat under guard that night, I listened to the rain tapping against the barrels of American rifles. I realized that the sound had become the rhythm of this war, constant, indifferent, endless. We had fought them for 3 years, on every island, in every jungle, under every sky. And now, finally, the empire that had sent us here was ashes. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Peleliu to Iwo Jima and now Okinawa, each island had been a lesson, and each lesson had been written in blood. We had believed that the human spirit was stronger than the machine. The Americans had proved otherwise. They had become something beyond men, living embodiments of discipline, patience, and purpose. We had learned to fear them not because they were cruel, but because they were inevitable. They fought like a storm, and you cannot hate the storm. You can only endure it, or be destroyed by it. When I was sent to a prisoner camp weeks later, I was asked by an American interpreter, "What did you think of the Marines?" I thought for a long time before answering. I said quietly, "They are not demons. They are craftsmen. They carve victory from flesh and fire." The interpreter said nothing. He just nodded, as if he already knew. Okinawa was the end of Japan's war in every way but name. After it, there were no more illusions left, no more faith in invincibility, no more belief in divine protection. The empire had built an army of spirit. America had built an army of endurance. And in the end, endurance was stronger. When I closed my eyes that night in the cap, I dreamed of rain falling endlessly on black sand and the sound of Marines advancing through the mud. Steady, unbroken, eternal. That was the sound of defeat.
August 1945. The war ended not with a battle, but with silence. The kind of silence that felt heavier than gunfire. I was still in the prison camp when we heard the news. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Emperor's voice on the radio. The guards turned off the broadcast halfway through, but we had already heard enough. His words were calm, almost gentle, yet every syllable cut through our pride like a blade. For the first time in history, the Emperor had spoken directly to his people. For the first time, we were told not to die for him, but to live. I remember sitting under the guard tower, staring at the rusted barbed wire, wondering what living even meant. For years we had been told that death was honor, that survival was shame. Now honor was gone, and survival was all that remained. The Marines still stood watch outside the camp, quiet and expressionless. Some of them smoked cigarettes as the sun went down, their silhouettes framed against the blood-orange sky. They didn't look like conquerors. They looked like men who had seen too much of the world and were tired of it. When we were finally released, I returned to a homeland I barely recognized. The cities were ashes. Tokyo was a skeleton of itself, rows of chimneys and broken walls stretching to the horizon. My family's home in Yokohama had been reduced to rubble. My mother was gone, my father too. Only my younger sister had survived, her hair white from malnutrition, though she was barely 20. She did not cry when she saw me. She simply said, "You came back," as if it were something impossible. In the weeks that followed, I wandered through the ruins of the empire I had once believed eternal. The people moved like ghosts, silent, hollow-eyed, dressed in rags. They spoke of the Americans not with hatred, but with a strange mix of awe and disbelief. The Marines were no longer our enemies. They were now the keepers of order. Their trucks rolled through the streets. Their soldiers handed out food, cigarettes, medicine. Some of them smiled at the children. To us, it was surreal. The men we had once called demons were rebuilding what they had destroyed. One afternoon near the docks of Yokosuka, I saw a group of Marines standing beside an American transport ship. They were laughing softly, passing around a tin of coffee, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. One of them caught my gaze and nodded. Without thinking, I nodded back. In that moment, the entire war seemed to collapse into that single gesture. Two soldiers, once sworn to kill each other, acknowledging that neither of us had won anything worth keeping. At night, I wrote in my old journal, the same one I had carried since Guadalcanal, its pages stained with mud and blood. I wrote, "We feared them because they never stopped. But perhaps they never stopped because they feared stopping." The Marines, I realized, had carried their own ghosts. For every victory they won, they buried a part of themselves in the sand. I thought often of the boy on Peleliu who offered me water, and the sergeant on Okinawa who said, "It's over." I wondered if they ever made it home.
I wondered if they could still sleep without hearing the sound of fire. For me, sleep came only in fragments, filled with echoes of gunfire and the cries of the dying. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the jungle or on the beach or in a tunnel filled with smoke. I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping, convinced that the battle had begun again. Years passed. The scars on my body faded, but the war never left. Japan changed. Factories rose where ruins had been. Trains ran again. Neon lights returned to Tokyo. The children grew taller, fatter, freer. But the men who had fought the war carried silence within them. We avoided one another in the streets, recognizing our own kind by the way we flinched at sudden sounds. We had once shouted "Banzai" in unison. Now we said nothing. Sometimes I would see American veterans walking through the same streets, older, heavier, carrying themselves with quiet pride. I never hated them. In truth, I envied them. They had fought for a country that still existed. We had fought for an idea that had turned to dust. One evening in 1952, during the signing of the U.S.-Japan peace treaty, I stood outside a small radio shop listening to the broadcast. The Prime Minister spoke of friendship, of rebuilding, of new alliances. The crowd around me clapped politely, but I could only think of the faces of the men who had died, Japanese and American alike, staring at each other through the fog of war. Peace was a strange word. It sounded too light to carry the weight of everything we had done. I often visited the military cemetery in Yokohama. Rows of white stones stretched endlessly, each one bearing a name and a number. Among them were graves of American Marines who had died on the islands I once defended. Their bodies had been brought here, across the same sea that had once divided us. I would stand before their graves and bow, not as an enemy, but as one soldier to another. In those moments I felt both shame and understanding. Shame for what we had believed, understanding for why they had fought. We had been told the Americans were soft, but they were not soft. They were unbreakable. We had been told that our spirit would conquer their machines, but their spirit had become a machine. The Marines did not fight for the Emperor or for glory or even for vengeance. They fought for each other, and that made them unstoppable. Over time, I realized that what terrified us most about the Marines was not their weapons or their tactics. It was their humanity. They killed without hatred, mourned without guilt, and lived without apology. They were everything we wanted to be, disciplined, fearless, loyal, but bound to a purpose that did not demand their souls. In my later years, I began writing about the war. Not for pride, not for redemption, but because memory demands witness. The young men of Japan knew nothing of Guadalcanal or Tarawa. Their world was filled with televisions and skyscrapers, not trenches and blood. When I told them about the Marines, they listened with curiosity, not fear. One of them asked me once, "Were they really that strong?" I smiled faintly and said, "No, they were just men who never allowed themselves to stop being soldiers." Sometimes I still dream of them, moving through smoke, rifles steady, faces calm. In those dreams, I am no longer afraid. We are all ghosts now, wandering the same battlefield that time itself has forgotten. The war taught me that courage without wisdom is suicide, and discipline without mercy is hell.
I am an old man now. The war feels like another lifetime, yet sometimes it returns to me as vividly as if it ended yesterday. When I walk through the quiet streets of modern Tokyo, filled with the hum of neon lights and the laughter of children, I still hear echoes of the past beneath the noise, the distant rumble of artillery, the sharp bark of rifles, the whispered voices of the Marines moving through the dark.
History has a way of fading from books, but never from those who lived it. I have carried these memories longer than I carried my rifle. People often ask me what the enemy was like, the Americans, the Marines. I always hesitate because to explain them is to explain a mirror. We believed we were the purest soldiers in the world, forged in loyalty, ready to die without question. But the Marines, they were what we thought we were. They fought with devotion, but their devotion was to each other. They fought with discipline, but it was not born of fear. They fought with strength, but never without purpose. We looked into their eyes and saw not hatred, but certainty, the kind that comes from a nation that knows what it is fighting for. I remember one day after the war, reading an article written by an American veteran who had fought at Tarawa. He wrote, "We respected the Japanese more than any enemy we ever faced. They never surrendered, and they never gave up." I folded the paper and laughed quietly. If only he knew that we said the same about them. The truth is that the Marines taught us something we never wanted to learn, that courage alone is not enough. Courage burns bright, but it burns fast. Endurance endures. The Americans endured. Their strength came not from the promise of heaven or the command of an emperor, but from the belief that the man beside them was worth living for. That is why we could not defeat them. They fought not for gods or glory, but for the living. In the years after the war, Japan was reborn from its own ashes. We traded swords for plows, uniforms for suits, and discipline for industry. The same precision that once built weapons now built cities. The same spirit that once fueled war now fueled creation. But even in peace, I sometimes wonder if we ever truly changed. The discipline remains, the obedience, the quiet endurance. Only now it is aimed at life instead of death. In that sense, the Marines live within us too. Every nation, I think, has two sides, the dream and the shadow. During the war, America's shadow marched across the Pacific in helmets and rifles. Ours lived in caves and whispered prayers before dying. When we met, those shadows consumed each other. What remained afterward was something neither side expected: respect. I returned to Iwo Jima once, decades after the war. The island was quiet, reclaimed by the sea and the wind. Mount Suribachi still stood dark and solemn, the waves still breaking on the black sand below. The caves where we once hid were filled with coral and moss. The battlefield had become a cemetery, but not one of defeat, one of remembrance. At the base of the mountain there stood a monument, two flags side by side, one American, one Japanese. The inscription read simply, "To the souls of all who fought here, may they rest in peace." I stood before it for a long time. The wind carried the sound of the sea, and for a moment I could almost hear voices, Japanese, English, all blending into one. I realized that the island no longer belonged to either of us. It belonged to time. As I looked out toward the horizon, I thought of the Marines who had died here, of the faces I had seen through smoke and fire. I thought of the boy who offered me water, of the sergeant who said, it's over. Of the nameless men who had carried their flag up Suribachi with trembling hands. They were gone, but their spirit remained, etched into the sand, into the wind, into the waves that refused to stop crashing against the shore. Sometimes people say we lost the war, and perhaps we did, but in that loss we found something greater, the understanding that even enemies can share honor. The Marines showed us that strength without mercy is tyranny, and mercy without strength is weakness. Somewhere between those two lies what it means to be human. When I speak to young people now, they listen politely, but I can see in their eyes that war to them is a story, not a wound. I do not wish to change that. I want them to live in a world where such stories remain only in books. But if they ask me what I learned, I tell them this: respect your enemy, but never become him. Remember the price of pride, but never forget the value of endurance. Because I have seen both pride that kills and endurance that saves. The Marines were not gods, and we were not devils. We were the same, bound by duty and shaped by orders, caught in a storm larger than either of us could control. But while we fought to die, they fought to return. And in the end, that made all the difference. Now, when I dream of the war, I do not see the flames or the dead. I see the ocean, endless, indifferent, eternal. The same ocean that carried us to war now carries our memories away, wave by wave, until only silence remains. Sometimes in that silence I imagine the sound of boots moving through sand, slow and steady, just as they did on those terrible beaches. I imagine the Marines, their faces young again, their rifles clean, their hearts still beating with that same relentless rhythm. They are not my enemies anymore. They are my teachers. And when I finally close my eyes